Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm joined today by a guest who my 6-year-old son was very excited I had her on the show. I'm joined today by Dr. Margaret Honey, who's the president and CEO of the Scratch Foundation. Margaret, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm really excited to be speaking with you today.
It's great to have you. And like I said, the fact that you impressed my 6-year-old, he's familiar. He's used Scratch Junior. He hasn't used Scratch, just Scratch, but that's certainly on his horizon. We'll get into that in a bit. Before we get to that, we always like to start by getting to know you a little bit better. Can you share with our listeners who you are and how you got to this point in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. So my personal story, I think, has a few kind of intersecting themes. When I was in high school, I read a really interesting book about an experimental school in the UK called Summerhill. And that kind of opened up the world for me of what education could be like when it was more child-centered. And I ended up in the early days of this school going to Hampshire College, which back in the 70s, late 70s, it was a very experimental, very novel institution where you really did get to design your learning experiences within the context of very broad requirements.
Just to jump in real quick, I attended New College of Florida, which historically was very similar to Hampshire. Now it's part of the culture wars. And in fact, there's a podcast that I've started called the Palm Court Podcast just about that. So for folks who want to learn more about New College, but it was very formative for me to, I think the credo there was in the final analysis, the student's responsible for his or her own education.
Yeah.
And I know Hampshire, in fact, when the takeover happened, many New College students wound up going to Hampshire, and, Hampshire really lent a hand to folks who were in a tough spot down there. So I know Hampshire well.
Exactly. So it's lovely that we have that in common. And when I decided I was going to go to grad school, I was literally, back in the days before the internet, standing in a registration line and started talking to the woman behind me, Leona Schabel, who was on the faculty at Vanderbilt for many years. Wonderful person. And I turned around and I said, I need a job. She said, oh, come talk to us. And I'm like, well, who's us? She said, Children's Television Workshop, what we now know as Sesame Workshop.
Wow.
And I ended up going there and working for a new division of the company called the Children's Computer Workshop. And so we were very, very, very early in the business of making educational but entertaining software for young people.
Is it the 80s or so?
Yeah, it was the 80s. I went to the workshop in about, I don't know, it was 81, 82. And, got really interested in this sort of new interactive media platform. Went from the workshop to Bank Street College of Education and ended up running the Center for Children and Technology, which has been around for a long time. And I had so many wonderful opportunities there. And what really resonated with me was the idea that you could design media in a way that would center children's curiosity, their questions, their passions, their agency. And I spent 15 years in a science center running the New York Hall of Science in Queens.
I'm in Brooklyn. I have been there.
That's great. It's a wonderful place. And a lot of what we did at the Hall of Science was really think about the ways in which you design exhibit experiences, but also media more broadly in ways that would do that, would center children's curiosity, their creativity and agency. So joining Scratch in this leadership capacity it's just been one of the most fabulous opportunities I've ever had in my life, because Scratch is all about that. It's all about centering children's curiosity, their passions, and enabling them to do that work in collaboration with other young people. And we're doing that at scale. So just quickly, we had 21.5 million new users on the platform in 2024 from every country in the world.
Wow.
Pretty
That's
extraordinary.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And as I mentioned, you're hot among the 6-year-old
The
set here
kids,
in Brooklyn. My son knew all about Scratch Junior, but folks who may not know what Scratch is, can you catch us up a little bit on what Scratch is and what it's focused on?
absolutely. So Scratch was developed at the MIT Media Lab by Mitch Resnick. And
Mm,
what Mitch set out to do was he didn't want to create a platform that would teach kids in a formal way how to code. What he wanted to do was create an accessible, visual, playful approach to coding so that kids could use code as a tool for
mm,
their creative ideas, for the work they wanted to do, projects they wanted to make, the passions they wanted to express, all of that. And Scratch debuted in 2007.
mm.
Since then, we've seen more than 150 million young people on the platform. We crossed last year the threshold of a billion projects being
Wow.
created. And, we're continuing to see extraordinary uptake year after year after year.
Mm,
And I think the reason for that is that a lot of our users discover Scratch in schools, but many of those users go on to create accounts at home. And I think it's because they recognize it is a place for them to connect with
mhm,
one another. Nobody's telling them what to build, what to make, or how to do it. They
mhm.
they learn from others in the community, and they're free to make, you know, whatever they want on the platform. So it really
Yeah.
centers young people's agency.
That's amazing. It is a time where as a parent of a 6-year-old, this is going to be very much in honor of my son, this interview, but it is a time where folks are wondering what work will be like in 10, 15 years. What will college be like? What will, the future of education, the future of work be? It's got to be stuff that, comes across your desk semi regularly. And, I would imagine, at least, from my perspective, it does look like the world is kind of moving in your direction. We'll get into AI and the future of coding in a little bit, but how are you thinking about that? How do you think about the future of work and how do you think about how that should connect to early childhood right through K-12 education?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I've listened to some of the other guests you've had on your show, Mike, talk, really passionately and eloquently about what the future of work, what are the kinds of skills and competencies, what are the habits of mind that young people need
Mm,
to develop. And it is very central to how we think about Scratch. I mean, I think fundamentally, particularly in a world where AI is likely to become a kind of constant tool that
yep.
we are
Yep.
using and working with,
Hmm.
I think two things. There are many things that are going to be important, but we talk a lot about Scratch, about the importance of curiosity and the importance of imagination, because those are distinctly human attributes that are so critical to our ability, let me put it positively, to really remain kind of in the driver's seat, to remain efficacious about how we choose to use and deploy technologies to enhance our own abilities, our own creative competencies, our own ideas, and not let machines do all that for us. So I think
Right.
curiosity and imagination are really, really critical.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think is baked into what you were talking about, is a maker's mindset. Like the idea that rather than a consumer of things, I'm also a maker of things. It's very constructivist, I guess, in that sense,
Right.
where you have to actively engage with the platform to make things. Can you describe a little bit what the platform is? Because they're not technically, are they writing code? Are they not?
What Mitch did was design a visual system of coding. So the best way to think about it is think about Lego bricks and
Mhm.
imagine different Lego bricks that have different kinds of functions built into them. And what Scratch allows you to do is assemble and define the functions of those bricks in ways that enable you to bring your creative ideas to life. So
Mm.
kids use this visual approach to coding to create games, to tell stories, to produce animated environments. Girls in particular, I think, love to use Scratch as a kind of journaling sort of tool. They use it in so many different kinds of ways for so many different creative purposes. And we have a global youth advisory board, and these are pretty experienced vouchers, but they range in age from about 9 to 16. They come from 15 countries around the world. There are 50 of them. And, for them, Scratch is important because it did teach them about coding. It allowed them to learn and use coding, learn how to use coding as a tool that they could create and make with. Back to what you said. And it's an important distinction, right? Because you don't go onto the Scratch platform and engage with a paint by number script. There's none of that. It's a kind of open-ended sandbox where you get to explore, you get to tinker, you get to mess about to figure out how things can be built and how different blocks can fit together in different kinds of ways to, again, bring your project to life, whether it's a game, whether it's an animation, whether it's a story you're telling. There was one user recently, when I was a kid, one of the things I remember doing with my girlfriends is like we lie in the grass in the back of our homes and look up at the sky, and we'd imagine what the clouds were. And there was a young woman using the platform who invented the ability to do that on Scratch, which I thought was
Nice.
just magical,
Mm-hmm.
So many different creative things that kids come up with.
Yeah. The other aspect that this hits on for me is the future of work. In addition to being about making things, I'm envisioning it as being much more entrepreneurial. And that's where it does seem like your platform. Just to do justice to my son, he did want to know about the difference between Scratch Junior, which he's using as a 6-year-old, and Scratch. So we'll hit that quick. But the fact that he's in there making things and he understands it's in his computer class, so it's kind of given the stamp of approval by his school, and it's something that is sort of future facing. So he's almost developing a vision of himself as someone who knows how to code and knows how to make things with this technology. I think he might be ready for his call up to the big leagues, Margaret. What's the distinction between Scratch Junior and Scratch?
Well, Scratch Junior is designed for younger children. So the architecture, the way in which you work with the blocks and code is a little bit more simplified. It tends to sort of 5, 6, 7 tend to be the kind of key ages there. And then Scratch picks up sort of 8 to 16, with 12 being the median age of users on our platform. But Mike, let me just say, it sounds like you have an amazing, very talented, very creative son. And my guess is he could probably graduate to Scratch, given his experience on Scratch Junior now, or maybe a few months from now. It sounds like he's really caught the bug.
Yeah, he has. And it's interesting you mentioned bugs, because that's the other thing I wanted to go to kind of next, is that another aspect of coding and really just getting things done in the digital age is a sense of grit and resilience and trial and error. I've heard people talk about the fact that we're losing our ability to, quote, do hard things because everything's being made easier for us. It does seem like there's some durable skills kind of baked into your platform there, where you got to have a little bit of attention to detail and testing and debugging. How do you think about that?
We talk a lot about the importance of productive tension, of, kids really wanting to persist through problem solving. And, if you check out online message boards where kids are getting together and talking about Scratch, Reddit has a big community. There are really interesting posts that surface because Scratch has been open source and lots of people have forked our code. Somebody recently forked the code and embedded AI in Scratch. And the chat on this Reddit board was all about, this is so not Scratchy. This is not what Scratch was meant to be. It's doing it all for you. And I think you are raising a really important conceit that Scratch holds very close, which is kids relish the opportunity, if they are motivated by what they want to make and create, to persist through a process of problem solving. And it involves sort of logical thinking. It involves debugging. It also involves messing up and experimenting and figuring out where you went wrong. And I think the mastery that comes with that kind of productive struggle is very, very, very important to users on the Strat platform, and something
Mhm.
that, particularly as we begin to think more about the role that AI can play in Scratch, we want to be very careful to maintain. We don't want AI to be something that does it all for you. That's not the
Yeah.
point. We want
Yeah.
AI to be a tool that you can use to help you solve problems or enhance your curiosity or broaden how you're thinking about a set of ideas or possibilities. We want it to be that kind of tool, but not do the work for you.
Yeah. And that opens up a lot of questions because that's really where AI is moving us in a direction where, there's more talk about coding jobs. Dario Amode at Anthropic had a pretty explosive post recently where he's talking about how entry level white collar jobs are potentially moving away. Folks have been talking a lot about the impact of AI on coding. The way I think about it as a parent of a kid who's using this stuff is there's a level of just literacy and competence that, I'm not necessarily thinking my son's going to be a coder. Who knows what that'll be in 10, 15 years anyway. But he should understand the building blocks, understand some of the fundamentals, and have that almost baked into his identity from an early age so that technology is not just scary, especially they're calling them alpha generation, which is driving me crazy. But, for that generation, they're going to be growing up with this stuff. And, there's risk that there is a sense of the haves and the have nots. And the haves, what they'll have that'll differentiate them is a belief that they can do it. And these tools are kind of built for them.
That is exactly right. And I think what's going to be so important for your son's generation, the largest generation ever, by the way,
Mm,
Generation Alpha.
mm,
And they're the kids who begin, right? Or that generation begins with the birth of the iPhone, right? And
right. Hmm.
extends through now, 2025. That sensibility that you're describing of being able to shape and impact and ultimately design the technologies that you're working with is so critical. It is such a critical perspective to develop, and the kinds of skills and competencies, resilience, determination, problem solving, critical thinking, collaboration, all of
Mm.
that are, the skills that one of your podcasts had a whole debate over name. They should, and you had a great way of saying this, they shouldn't be called soft skills, but they should be called
Durable skills are the hot
durable,
ones.
exactly,
Yeah.
durable
Yeah.
skills. And I think you're so spot on about that, because I think as technologies become tools that are going to be doing more and more and more things for us, we have to ask ourselves, what are the distinctive human competencies and habits of mind that we want to bring to the equation? And I think those durable skills are just that. They are the skills and competencies that not only need to endure, but need to be actively cultivated. The other thing I wanted to say was listening to some of your other guests and your dialogue with them got me thinking about this. But, in our formal education system, we've kind of lost perspective on the fact that learning is a very foundational form of human development. And we put so much of the learning emphasis on outcomes, on your
Mhm.
performance on the test, right?
Yeah.
And we forget that learning is a developmental process that involves at its core sort of interaction and collaboration with other humans. That perspective is going to be really, really, really important to surface and prioritize as AI becomes, increasingly the tools that we are working.
And, we made it this far. I didn't say agentic yet, but there I did. Clippy's revenge is real. We're not just dealing with other humans. And, 10, 15 years from now, there's probably going to be all sorts of agents around us that we're going to need to communicate with at the same time. You talked about habits of mind, which is a nice turn of phrase. I like that framing. it's also like your mental models of what am I engaging with and how does this actually work under the hood? This is where, again, as parent of a 6-year-old, I feel very fortunate to have that awakening where he wants to know how everything, like the curiosity is everywhere.
Right.
But it feels like, there's a risk that you kind of take the off ramp and just let the technology do everything for you, where, the counter, I think, is perhaps more important. You talked about, productive struggle, desirable difficulty. There's some foundational like learning science ideas. Active learning almost requires that friction for you to really kind of deepen the understanding. How does your stuff relate to other aspects of sort of K-12 curriculum, the other stuff that you're learning? Is it normally delivered through a computer science class? You mentioned, I guess it's both available for folks with their parents and on their own at home. But then, my son, for example, is getting this through his school. How do folks typically get exposed to Scratch?
Yeah, I think there are really interesting geographic differences. And, we don't know those differences deeply and well enough, but, we encounter them through people who are using Scratch around the world and through organizations who are using Scratch. But
Mhm.
I think in the US, the primary focus has really been using Scratch to teach kids how to code and leaning into learning the syntax of that
Yep.
process has been primary. There's an interesting trend for OECD organizations around the world. I'm sure many of your listeners know about the PISA assessment, the Program in International Student Assessment, which is run by OECD. This year, they are debuting a new assessment called Learning in the Digital World. And it's
Mm.
really trying to be discerning about two things. Can young people use technology as a tool to solve problems? And two, can they use technology as a platform to build representations of their knowledge? And the latter should sound a lot like Scratch, right? Because
Yeah.
that's what, when kids, when they create their own Scratch accounts, they go home to do projects that are about building representations of their knowledge. And indeed, in the framework document that describes learning in the digital world, OECD cites Mitch Resnick and his mentor, Seymour Papert, and a whole long legacy of other researchers who have been focused on principles of constructivist learning as the most powerful ways in which kids can develop those habits of mind that
Mhm.
allow them to have those kind of enduring, durable skills that will serve them well in the future. So the point of mentioning that is as this assessment rolls out, and I heard that there are 82 countries around the world that have opted in taking the assessment this year. I think we will see shift in how Scratch and other block-based coding platforms are used across the curriculum, because the beauty of Scratch is you can deploy it anywhere. So Scratch can become a tool to build a representation of your physics project or your history
Right.
project or whatever it is you're working. And we know from decades of constructivist research that there's no better way to make learning sticky, to make learning
Yeah.
enduring and
Mhm.
powerful. You know, I think we've seen in the US a lot of leaning into learning the code and
Right.
the procedures of coding. But I think the rest of the world is actually going to move us in a direction of using technology more as a tool that is generative for problem solving purposes and generative for this kind of domain of building representations of your knowledge, of your thinking, of your ideas. And that's when you get to the exciting stuff, Mike, and you shift this whole question of who has agency, right, in a learning environment. There's a ton of research now that shows very clearly that the more young people have that sense of agency, their power and their participation in the learning process, the more productive their learning is.
Mhm. It also reminds me of the idea of building a portfolio rather than just a grade point
Yeah.
average, rather than what are your scores in these tests. It's like, what have you been able to make? And it's interesting, even when you were talking about the genesis of Scratch, going back to, your early years too, there was a time where the personal computer was new and we all had to adapt and come up with new frameworks and mental models around that. Then the internet hits, then social media hits, then mobile phones hit, and now AI is hitting. In a way, what it is to be human is to really be adaptable and be able to kind of adjust your frameworks. But what I keep hearing is you kind of need those underlying frameworks to begin with. So, like, this is the argument for coding, where, in some ways to engage with those AI agents and to keep them honest, it's best for humans to actually have those kind of
Yeah.
foundational understandings, those habits of
Yeah.
thought that you're describing. The other area I wanted to get to is perhaps a more critical one, which is, Jonathan Haidt's work on the anxious generation and really a movement. We probably let kids use social media and their phones more than they should. As a platform, I was checking with my son. He's using the iPad in class to kind of do his programming. So, it's probably different than the way we think about keyboard typing up
Right.
JavaScript or the way we might think about coding. But how do you think about the platforms and the screens that folks are using to do this programming? I keep coming back to like, VR, and will some of this stuff be abstracted in the future so that we're maybe not on screens? Also, I'm a podcaster, so can we do voice enabled programming? It's another question. But how do you think about that? How do you think about screens and sort of the future of technology, especially when you're dealing with kids?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say, I think Jonathan Haidt's work is extremely important. And he's really called global attention to
Yes.
what can be the negative consequences of social media, where algorithms are used to retain and kind of commodify young people's attention. I think
Yeah.
one of the most interesting things to me about Scratch is that we don't use any of those strategies to commodify young people's attention. They show up and are on the platform because they are finding what I call authentic value. They're
Mm.
finding other young people who they want to work with and collaborate. They're finding an opportunity to work deeply on a project they're really interested in. There's not one way to use Scratch. There are multiple ways to use Scratch. And I think that kind of flexibility is really important. So I'll tell you a story. About a year ago, maybe half a year ago, I was in Denmark and had an opportunity to visit schools. And we were outside of Copenhagen in a school community that was where the school buildings were quite spread out. And one of the things I began to notice is that kids were not walking around with phones. Like there was none of that phone in your face. They were talking to each other. They were sitting in groups. They were playing board games. They were, they were not on phones. And what I learned was that as a country, Denmark constrains the use of phones within school settings. And
Yep.
I was struck by what a positive atmosphere that created for young people and for the educators who are working with them. It created a much more engaged sense of community. I know it's a movement afoot in this country, and, I think we should take it seriously and pay attention to it. We think a lot because we are a tech platform. Kids are on screens, but, in the moment Mitch designed this, he gave a tremendous amount of thought to the ways in which Scratch could build an online environment that could support collaboration and the exchange of ideas among young people and
Hmm.
learning across cultures, which is quite stunning and fabulous. And as we think about improving the platform, as we think about what are the ways in which AI tools might be used to, for example, our global community has gotten huge. There are over 200 million projects in the global community, 47 million studios. Studios are kind of themed areas where kids make and create together around topics that they
Cool.
choose.
Yeah.
But it's hard to find your way around. And how might we use and deploy AI, not in the conventional algorithmic way of giving young people more of what they supposedly like, but actually to introduce ideas of serendipity, of surprise, of unexpected discovery. It's in
Mm,
my brain, it goes back to my standing in that registration line for grad school and meeting one of my fellow students. It opened up the entire world for me, the world
hmm.
I've spent my career in, working in.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in the power of surprise, the power of serendipity. I think it is and should always be an essential part of children's learning. And you know, I'll tell you another story. When I was at the Hall of Science, we had the co-creator of Siri come
Right.
talk to, we did a donor event around him, and he was amazing. And somebody in the audience said to him, how did you get to be you? Right? Like, how did you get to, how did you get to be this amazing creative
Yeah.
person? And he told the story of his mother used to like save up boxes that stuff came in and throw them down in the basement. And she would send him and his siblings down there and just go make something. And they would spend hours down there in this kind of, free form, unstructured play, building worlds. And attributed that to how he thinks, how he is, his career, the evolution of his thinking, the evolution of his work, the ideas, all of that process of sort of the unstructured kind of messing about, figuring it out. And I think that's so important for kids. I think it has everything to do with why Mitch designed Scratch the way in which he designed it, as a place where kids get to tinker, where kids get to mess about, where it's good to make mistakes because you're going to learn from them. You're going to learn how to improve and persist. So to the extent that anybody can build, the digital equivalent of the basement full of cardboard experience, I think Mitch Resnick did that with Scratch. And that kind of legacy and sensibility that is so central to our work at the Scratch Foundation that we want to always center and bake into, the new generations of Scratch that we're working toward.
We'll include links to all this on the show notes. I'm talking to Dr. Margaret Honey, who's the president and CEO of the Scratch Foundation. It's a nonprofit, been around for some time now, and you're actually getting to the point where you've educated more than one generation on some of these foundations of coding, which is kind of mind-blowing when you start to think about that as well. As we get closer to concluding, I always like to maybe give you an opportunity to give some advice perhaps to folks. You sound like you've embraced serendipity and it's gotten you to some amazing places, but any thoughts for our listeners if they're interested in education, they're interested in making an impact? What have you learned? What advice might you give?
So, it's such a fascinating moment in time when you reflect on kind of research and learning and how they come together in powerful ways. And one of the people I've gotten to know since I've joined Scratch is Bruce McCandless, who's a neuroscientist, a developmental neuroscientist on the faculty at Stanford. And Bruce has been doing a tremendous amount of interesting research on sort of modalities of learning and what they do for brain development. And his recent work shows really clearly that, and this is back to points you were making earlier in our conversation, that ability to make, to create, to problem solve, to be invested as a learner in what you are doing and having the capacity to shape it to some degree is so good for healthy brain development. So what many educators know intuitively is now showing up in the work that developmental neuroscientists like Bruce are doing at the intersection of, really trying to answer the question of what does productive learning look like? And I think it's such important information to know because, we now have many decades of developmental and constructivist research on learning that has been underscoring that learning through doing, learning through making, learning through creating, learning through problem solving is the most productive on multiple dimensions that you can measure, the most productive kind of learning that you can offer up to young people. And now we have concrete evidence that that same kind of learning contributes in the most productive way to healthy brain development. And, none of it, Mike, is rocket scientists. There are many, many, many hundreds of thousands of educators out there around the world who know that kind of learning is the most productive. I think the challenge in our country is that everything has become about the tests. And if we want to continue to grow and evolve as a nation, as a species, we absolutely have to change that paradigm and, get back to the basement with the boxes and creative play, whether you're doing it physically or digitally on Scratch. It's the kind of learning that we need to promote and make sure is available to all of our young people.
Yeah. And the global reach is a testament to the fact that there are some foundational elements to this stuff that is almost the future of how humans will learn and think about building things, think about making things their own personal identity. It's been an amazing conversation here with Dr. Margaret Honey, the president and CEO of the Scratch Foundation. As we're wrapping up here, Margaret, any concluding thoughts, any takeaways for our listeners who stuck around with us?
I'll share one thing, which is in October of 2025, we are hosting a convening in collaboration with Bruce McCandless from Stanford and Nick Haber, one of his colleagues at Stanford, two amazing researchers who work in the domain of, as I was talking about, Bruce, curiosity and learning across neuroscience and in Nick's case, AI. We're hosting a convening. We called it the Curiosity Convening with OECD, and we're bringing together a small group of amazing people from around the world to assemble around both the kind of research and practice dimensions of what we know about the most effective ways to engender learning that is curious and anchored in doing and creating and making, and that is doable, in some of our very large education system. So we have people from Japan attending and Singapore attending and other countries attending this convening as well who work at the ministry level, because I think there is a real movement afoot to underscore the importance of things like curiosity and imagination as core elements of what the learning process needs to look like for young people. So
that's exciting
stay
stuff.
tuned for information that comes out of that.
Sounds great. And then, it does sound like a time when if folks want to see where this stuff is heading, there's plenty of resources that we'll be sharing. Scratch is a foundation, and the work that you're doing is helping folks understand how to do this in a way that makes sense. Dr. Margaret Honey, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thank you, Mike. It was such a pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
And for our listeners, hopefully you liked what you heard. If you did, please write us a review, subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.